I'm not sure how many of you fly. I think IFR is no fun. IFR with no electricity in the dark is really, really no fun. Your life hangs on maybe 1-2 instruments, attitude indicator. You don't have any more backups left. That's it. Your life is this instrument here, and the one tells you airspeed.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for episode 87 of the Aviation News Talk podcast. I'm your host, Max Truscott, and you just heard Dr. Peter Edenhofer, who was saved by the rather unique actions of 3 air traffic controllers who recently won the NATCA, that's the National Air Traffic Controllers Association, President's Award for the Best Save of the Year. And today I'll be sitting down with Phil Ennis, one of those 3 air traffic controllers who was honored for their actions, and we'll talk about how they helped bring the doctor down after his complete electrical failure while flying IFR at night on Super Bowl Sunday last year. But first, if you're new to the show, well, we have a weekly show that shares pilot safety tips and general aviation news, and helps connect you with a broader community that's championing general aviation around the world. And I hope you'll click on the subscribe button so that new episodes of the show will download automatically to your phone each week. And after the show, if you find yourself wanting just a little bit more on this story, I posted a video with all of the air traffic control audio and video that was shown at the recent awards ceremony, and you can find it at our Patreon site at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. Just click on post. You'll also find a link to the site in our show notes. And if you like what you see, you can sign up to donate a few dollars a month, and you can access all the other content that I post for Patreon supporters. That's aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. Now, I want to mention that 3 controllers won the Archie League Medal of Safety Award for the save we're going to talk about. They are Thomas Hurd, Hugh Hunton, and Phil Ennis. Earlier, I sat down with Phil Ennis, and here's our conversation. Now, before we get started, let me tell you first a little bit about Phil Ennis. Ennis is an air traffic controller at the Fort Worth Center, where he's worked for the last 29 and a half years. He's married, has 2 sons, and he lives in his hometown just 1 block from where he grew up. But the reason he's in the news is that he and some of his fellow controllers recently received an award for saving a doctor in a Cessna Cardinal who was in a dire situation. Phil, I'd like to officially welcome you here to the Aviation News Talk podcast. I'm excited to have you here.
Thank you, Max. Thanks for having me on.
Well, so tell us first a little bit about how you became an air traffic controller.
Well, in 1988-89, I was attending college, and my mother worked for FEMA. And when I came home for Christmas break in 1988, I was low on funds for finishing college, and so I was going to have to get a job. And she told me about the test for post office and general services and air traffic control. I had never really considered air traffic control, but that was the only test that was available during my Christmas break. So I went and took the test and received an application packet and was at the academy in June of 89. And at Fort Worth Center in September of 89, and I've been there ever since.
Wow. So you've only worked at one location the entire time?
Yes, that's correct. It's like I said, I live in my hometown. My family has a farm here that I still help my father with. So it's close enough to home for me to live here, and I've lived here all my life.
Now, is it kind of unusual for a controller to spend their entire career at just one facility?
It's not terribly uncommon, but many controllers do move around, sometimes 6 or 8 or 10 times. If you go into the en route option, it takes longer to train, but you can reach the top end of the pay scale in one facility without having to. If you're in the tower option, to move up, you have to move to a busier facility. So if you go in the en route option, you can stay in one place if you choose to.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense because a lot of the controllers I know are at my local airport. That's a smaller tower. So, of course, they're then move to a larger tower to, move their career ahead a little bit further.
Yes.
So before we talk about your recent save, tell us first a little bit about the Archie League Awards. Just what are those?
Well, Archie League is, as my understanding, is considered to be the first air traffic controller. I believe he was hired in St. Louis with flags signaled to aircraft whether it was safe to land or to not. And when NATCA put together NATCA is the National Air Traffic Controllers Association. When NATCA put together the awards, they named the award after Archie League to honor controllers for a save or something that was extraordinary outside the norm.
Well, this is a pretty big deal. Give us an idea how many controllers there are in the United States and roughly how many Archie awards are given out each year.
There are 10 regions, and there's one award for each region. This year, there were 2 regions that they had submissions that they felt they couldn't choose between, so they just declared it a tie, and they ended up with 12 regional awards. And then in the end, the president of the union selects one to be the President's Award winner. And this year, he felt that there were 2 that he couldn't decide between, so there were 2 President's Awards winners this year.
And your award was one of those, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Yeah, that's great. And roughly how many controllers are there in the United States?
I believe there are around 14,000, 15,000, somewhere in that neighborhood. They've been doing a lot of hiring lately, but we have a lot of people retiring now too.
Wow, so this is pretty rare. Most controllers would not receive one of these awards in their entire career.
It's quite an honor just to be nominated for it, whether you receive even the regional award or not. It's an honor to have an event happen where your peers and the leadership feel that it's worth being nominated for the award. Even to be considered for it is an honor.
Yeah, I always enjoy reading about the Archie League Awards every year because there's just some amazing stories buried in there. And I don't think they get nearly the exposure that they should get to pilots. Clearly, controllers know all about this, but I wish more pilots knew about the Archie League Awards. So let's kind of go back in time here. Let's talk about Super Bowl Sunday 2017. The big game was being held in Houston, which is obviously under your area there. Tell us what the weather was like that day.
Well, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, the weather was fair. The front had moved through, and it was still IFR to the east of us. The IFR conditions were moving to the east, but not too far east of DFW. It was a solid IFR with very low ceilings and poor visibility. And
so tell us how you first became aware that there was a Cessna Cardinal that might be getting into trouble.
It was about 9:30, 9:40 local time, and the game was nearing an end. The game had just gone. It was tied, and they were fixing to start the overtime session. And I came back to see who wanted to take a break and maybe go watch the end of the game. And the controller I was relieving had just cleared the Cardinal for approach at Paris Airport.
And I've got to pause our interview with Phil for just a moment to play you some of the actual transmissions where that Cardinal was cleared for the approach.
November 34731, cross Cupo at or above 3,000. Cleared RNAV GPS runway 35 approach.
And crossing Cupo at or above 3,000, cleared for RNAV 35731.
November 34731, report Cupo.
And 731 will report Cupo.
November 34731, radar contact lost. In November 34731, there's a good chance I'll lose you on radios also here. Your radar service is terminated. Report your cancellation or downtime this frequency or flight service. I'm going to give you an alternate Fort Worth Center frequency of 123.9 or 2, 2392 for your cancellation also.
Okay, 1239.
So as he's giving me the briefing, he's gone over everything, told me what approach the aircraft is on, that he's just cleared him off the frequency and we should be getting his cancellation soon. And the briefing is over. I've taken over the sector, and he's still standing there talking to me. And we notice the Cardinal's transponder code reappears near Paris, but it's already above the missed approach altitude, and it's still climbing. And the target reacquires where the data tag goes back onto the transponder code that we see. That lasted for about 30 seconds. And during that time, I tried to make contact with him, but did not get a response. Then he changed his transponder to emergency squawk. It showed emergency for about 30 seconds. And then that went away. And then all we were left with was a primary target, which was heading southwest away from the airport. The last altitude we had seen was around 6,000 feet, and he was still climbing. So we knew something unusual was going on, but we couldn't make any radio contact. So then we were just left to follow it and see what was going on and attempt to make contact.
And I see that at Paris Airfield, they were reporting at the time 3/4 of a mile visibility with a 200-foot ceiling. So that's pretty low IFR. Anybody who has an emergency probably isn't going to be able to get back into there. Now, tell us what that means when you see just a primary target.
Our main radar system gives us interrogates the transponder and produces that data onto the screen. The primary radar is just the reflective radar that reflects off the skin of the airplane and gives a signal back, a echo, and produces a plus sign on the screen that we follow.
So if you see somebody who's squawking 7,700 and that goes away, and then you just see a primary target, what kind of conclusions would you typically draw from that?
Well, our initial thought was correct that he had lost his electric power and he had a full electric failure. We were very, very fortunate in that we were able to reacquire him before his power failed completely, because had that not happened, another 15, 20 minutes would have gone by and we would have determined that he was overdue and probably started looking for him at the Paris airport and not flying away from the airport. It's not unusual to see primary targets out there. Not everyone has to talk to us. And I don't know if we would have made the assumption that that was him flying away or not. I honestly don't think that we would have if we had not seen the transponder code and known that that was him.
Wow, so he was really lucky that there was just enough power left for that 7,700 to squawk for 30 seconds or so. Otherwise, you might not have known for hours that he was still flying around trying to figure out what to do.
That's correct.
So now you've got an airplane where you know they've got some kind of problems. What are the first steps that you took in that situation to, try and contact the pilot?
Well, we try him on all of our different radios and transmitters to see if there's any one of the different transmitters that he might be able to hear. We try him on the guard frequency, which is the 121.5 frequency. We would attempt to, offer him, if you can hear Fort Worth Center ident, if maybe he can't transmit.
And this is what that sounded like.
November 34731, this is Fort Worth Center on guard. If you hear Fort Worth Center, ident. November 34731, this is Fort Worth Center on guard. If you hear me and you have a cell phone, call area code 817-858-7837. We tried all of those things. We didn't get anything. We had an aircraft that was landing DFW broadcast for him on the frequency, hoping maybe from that vantage point they could hear. But again, nothing. He wasn't hearing anything. So he was not getting any of the radio information. Then the next step, I called flight service and asked them to look up his flight plan to see if there was any identifying information or hopefully a phone number, anything that would help us start our search. All they had was the pilot's name. So that was where we started, with his name. And while this is going on, the other 4 or 5 people in the room, sensing, understanding what's going on, because we can all hear each other, they started looking at the weather at all the different airports, trying to find out, where it went from VFR or IFR to VFR, because he was headed in the right direction. But if we were able to establish communication with him, we needed to be able to give him a VFR airport if indeed he did have an electrical failure. So there were a lot of brainstorming going on. Someone, and I don't know to this day who it was, said, told the supervisor, let's just Google his name. So they typed his name into Google, and it came up with a neurologist based in Paris by that name. We thought, well, that's got to be him. So we started down that path of trying to find a number for him through that method. We called his office. The supervisor called his office, and it just went to a recording. So then someone suggested to contact the hospital.
So looked up the hospital in Paris. The supervisor called and told him who he was and that we had a possible emergency situation. And if they had any information on this doctor, particularly a number, we needed it. And the young lady on the other end of the line reluctantly gave it to him, but she did give it to him. And so he tried to call it would give about half a ring and then it would cut off. The call wouldn't connect at all. We can make phone calls from the radar positions as well. So we tried to call through that system. It did the same thing. And by this time, we had split the sector so that the low sector was separated from the high sector. And there was a controller sitting there just broadcasting on the guard frequency just in case the pilot could hear the guard transmission, that he would be able to get the information maybe that he needed, even if he couldn't respond to us. Turns out he never heard any of that, but that was what we were trying to do. But I was relieved off of what was left of that sector. I was not on the low sector anymore calling on the guard. And so I took the phone number and I said, well, I'm going to send this guy a text. And we're not supposed to have our cell phones in the control room. So I walked out to the area where it's okay. And I sent him a text, something like, this is Fort Worth Center. Please respond if possible. And then I blanked out the screen on my phone and walked back in the area. And I was standing there next to the sector that was making the broadcast in the blind to him.
And I'm going to pause our interview for just one moment. This is what Dr. Peter Edenhofer was thinking about this time while he was up in the air.
For 5,000 feet in the corridor, that's not quite 500 feet per minute. So I say about almost 15 minutes I was climbing, flying the plane. Sent out a distress signal. I had no clue if they got it. I figured, they're probably watching the game. No one saw it. And then you get above the clouds, and it's really surreal. Stars, beautiful star, and there's just this white pillow. And you are alone. A little message in the bottle, and anyone can find you. And then you figure, no. And then you figure, well, maybe I should just end it. Then I thought, well, fortunately, I didn't have autopilot. You can just stick on the autopilot and let the autopilot kill you. So I figured, well, that's kind of dumb. And besides, I made it all the way here. I'm not going to be a number or statistic for NTSB, and I don't have a little black box, so no one will know what happened to me. So you know what? I'm going to make it. So I pull out the cell phone. I was going to say goodbye to my kids. Start doing that. I saw there's a signal. Fast forward. They couldn't help me, and I get a text from the Cavalier. Hey, this is Fort Worth Center, and I was thinking, man, you really? You don't know what that felt like. I went from this is it, and not a panicky this is it, like logically this is it. I don't know how much fuel I got. No one knows I'm here. I don't know where to go. I got a compass, by the way. That's all you have is a compass. That's not much. You need 2 points to navigate, right?
And after about 2 minutes, he responded. I told the supervisor that I had got a response, and he said to go with it. See what information he needs. What can we do? So he told us that he was headed to Greenville Majors Airport and that he was minimum fuel, and so he needed the lights on, which we had already figured out that he needed. If he'd had an electrical failure, he wouldn't be able to turn on the lights. So the controllers in the adjacent area who received the award with me, they were working on getting the lights on, having aircraft flying out of VFW to do the mic clicks to turn on the lights. Supervisor over there was in contact with the airport manager, and he had jumped in his vehicle and was getting out there as quick as he could to be there to physically say, yes, the lights are on. I continued providing information to the pilot about his location, the weather, airports that were VFR. Majors was marginal, but to the little further to the west, things improved greatly. But he didn't have the fuel, he thought, to go anywhere but Majors. They had the fire trucks go to the airfield, and get beside the runway with their lights on to try to give him something to see if he was able to see through the clouds.
At the end there, kind of a fast forward at the very end there, I didn't say anything. I saw them text me, honest, where are you guys? I saw you guys texting. I was busy. There's a hole in the clouds, and I dove for it. So I didn't know how much fuel I have. I figured this is it. If I don't make it now, that might be it. So I went for broke. So that's why I didn't answer you right away, okay? But anyway, it was crazy. Oh, by the way, I knew I was Greenville Airport because, through the clouds you can see white, and then I saw pulsing red. I figured that's the airport. They probably call the fire trucks. A lot of transmissions going back and forth without talking, but just feeling we're on the same wavelength. So I found it and landed, squeaker, and then engine shut off and nothing. Just deafening silence. All this noise in your brain for so long, and then there's nothing. And that was it.
He said he saw an opening and he dove through the clouds and he saw the red lights and he headed that way and there was the runway and he was finally able to touch down.
Well, that's remarkable. So if it hadn't been for that hole in the clouds, he probably wouldn't have been able to get down because he had essentially no navigation equipment that's working on the airplane.
That's correct. He was relying on the GPS app on his phone to point him kind of in the right direction, but he did not have any navigation equipment.
I see. So to get toward Greenville, he was essentially using an electronic flight bag app like ForeFlight or something like that, and that's how he was navigating?
Yes, something on it, some navigation app that he had on his phone, he said.
Wow. Talk about how valuable having that kind of backup could be in a situation like that. I'm looking here at the text messages here. It says toward the end here, you said, please verify you have safely landed at Majors. And he texted back, landed safely by the grace of God.
Yeah, that was a pretty moving text to receive.
Yeah, I can imagine. I would imagine you guys were overjoyed. Were there a lot of high fives going on?
Yes, when so the supervisor that was on the phone with the airport manager, he walked around the corner and he had the handheld phone and he said, the airport manager said an airplane just landed with no lights. And 3 or 4 of us all at one time said, well, we got to know the tail number. We got to know it's him. And so the supervisor got back on the phone and said, can you verify the tail number? And about 30, 40 seconds later, he said, yeah, it's the right one. And it was like a collective cheer, and we all felt great. And then we went back to work, I guess.
Yeah, I can imagine that was quite a moving event to know that he had safely landed. I mean, a lot of people, obviously, in similar circumstances, don't have such a good outcome.
Yes, that's unfortunately true. A lot of times when things like this happen, it ends up being something that you go home at night not knowing what has happened, and then the next day you get the news that there was a tragedy, and it's never a good feeling.
So the pilot was Dr. Peter Edenhofer. You met him later on. What did he tell you about what was going on in the aircraft while you guys were on the ground trying to help him out? Well,
he said that when he missed approach, or when he had the electrical failure, he was on approach, and he immediately climbed because when the power started to fail, every time he would key the mic on his radio, all the lights would go out, and he could tell something was wrong. So that's when he started climbing, and he switched to the emergency squawk. But he said from his end, it appeared to him that nothing was working. So he wasn't sure if we ever saw the emergency squawk or not. So he was thinking, no one knows that I'm not going to land at Paris. No one knows what's going on. It's Super Bowl Sunday. I'm out here by myself. So he had gotten out his phone out of his bag, and his feeling was that he, might not have a successful end to this flight. And he had texted his son, who was waiting there at the airport to pick him up, to tell him that he was in difficulty and basically to tell him goodbye. It was, that was when we met him, when he came to the facility to meet us, there wasn't a dry eye in the room after he told us that part of the story, because we were all trying to put ourselves in his shoes. And, of course, none of us could, but trying to empathize with that feeling is, that's a gut-wrenching thing. But he was, in the airplane in complete darkness, with just his phone, and not knowing if he had enough fuel, because he didn't have a fuel gauge anymore. He knew he was low, but he didn't know how low. And then he said he had considered, what's going to happen if if the engine sputters out and I run completely out of fuel, what am I going to do? And he had a lot of thoughts on, how that was going to play out, and none of them were good. But when he received the text that indicated that the personnel at Fort Worth Center knew that he was in trouble, he said he, started thinking more positively about how this might work out. And, ultimately it did.
Yeah, I'm sure as a pilot in that kind of situation, it's really kind of helpful to know that there's someone on the ground who's kind of watching and, kind of cares about your outcome, even if they can't necessarily help you as much as you'd like.
Yes.
Well, it's a remarkable story. You guys did a fantastic job. I'm kind of wondering, what was it like for you as you went home that night? And, were you able to kind of peacefully fall asleep or stay up for a while?
Well, of course, my shift ended at 10:30 that night, and I headed home. It's about a 45-minute drive for me to get home. So about halfway home, I called my wife to kind of try to tell her what had happened. Now, of course, she's not a controller and doesn't know anything about aviation or anything really about what we do other than what I try to explain. But, she patiently listened and said, well, that's really nice. She was, happy that it worked out. But I got home, and normally I go straight to bed, but this night I didn't. And I was wide awake. My mind was racing. And it was probably 2 or 3 in the morning before I was able to fall asleep. It was just a lot of adrenaline awful late at night there.
So what was it like going to work the next day?
Well, so next day I go into work, and when I walked into the control room, when you walk in, there's turn the corner to head down the hallway where all of the areas are. And there was a couple of operations managers up at the front desk where they're stationed. And, I've been there my whole career. Everybody knows me. And they called me over, and I thought that they would want to talk about what had happened the night before. And I really thought I was going to get a pat on the back or an attaboy. But the first thing they were concerned about was me having my cell phone in the control room, because we're not supposed to have our cell phones on in the control room. There's lots of signs around that indicate that, and a line on the floor that you're not supposed to have your phone on past that point. And so I explained to them that I had made the first text in the area where texts are okay or phones are okay, but then I did go back in the area, and when I got a response, then I texted with them. And they were concerned about, if I had texted actually in the control room, or was it out in the hallway, or was it up here at the operation manager's desk? And I started to see that I wasn't there to get a pat on the back. I was being questioned about the cell phone. But the facility manager and our union president immediately quashed all that. That went nowhere. There was never any discipline or any talk of discipline after, that initial discussion about what had happened. But it was just felt weird to feel like you've saved someone and then be questioned about how you did it.
Well, it sounds like the appropriate decision was made in this particular case. I've always believed that for many rules, there are exceptions. Would you think that this is one of those rules for which this is the perfect exception?
Yes, exactly. Well, there's like when an aircraft declares emergency, they can do whatever they need to do to maintain the integrity of their aircraft, much like Dr. Edenhofer didn't have an IFR flight plan to fly from Paris to Majors, but he certainly did, because he did what he had to do. And so we received an award from an organization called ATC in November of 2017. And the group of us that went to Washington to receive that award, the supervisor spoke for the group. And I thought he summed it up well when he said, we did everything we were supposed to do. And when none of that worked, then we started doing the things we're not supposed to do. And, those were successful. So it's not like we whipped out the phone and started doing that right off the bat. That was after we had tried everything we could think of. We were grasping at straws. So that's when we moved to that option.
Well, you certainly grabbed the right straw, that's for sure. Yeah, you're talking about the pilot's emergency authority, which, by the way, has always been my favorite rule. It basically says that a pilot in an emergency can break any regulation they need to the extent of the emergency. And I think what I like about that is it basically means we trust you. We don't want you flying into a mountain so that you don't break a regulation. Is there any such rule for air traffic controllers, or is it just kind of good judgment that's applied in situations like this?
And basically, it would just be good judgment applied, and hopefully those who evaluate that judgment see things the same way you did.
Yeah. Sounds like a new rule that ought to be added to the controller handbook.
Yes. I wish, and Dr. Edenhofer has been a proponent of this in groups that he's spoken with, of putting every pilot, if they have a cell phone or a satellite phone, put that in the remarks section of the flight plan. When that happens, it makes things so much easier.
Wow, that's a really great suggestion. So anybody flying a flight plan, put their phone number in the remarks section. Boy, I hadn't thought about that, but that would have made it so much easier for you in this case.
Yes. And there's a lot of times where in the remarks, it'll have the pilot's name and a cell phone number. If it's a satellite phone, it'll say sat phone and have the number. And when that is available, there's been times since this event happened where we've lost communication with an aircraft, not an aircraft in distress, but just one that took a wrong frequency or somehow got out of range. And the supervisor or the operations manager has been able to communicate with them via text and get them back on the proper frequency.
So just thinking in general, any particular advice you would give pilots for emergency situations or even maybe non-emergency situations? What would you wish that, pilots would do that perhaps they don't sometimes think to do?
Well, as far as emergency situations, being familiar with the emergency procedures for their aircraft, I've read NTSB reports. One here comes to mind where the pilot had tried to change his fuel from one wing to the other, and he had stopped turning the dial when it was in the middle, which was in the position where no fuel flows at all. And when he started losing engine power, the very first thing in the emergency handbook for that situation was to check the position of the fuel lever, and that didn't happen. And it ended up in a crash. A sad outcome that could have been avoided. It's one thing Dr. Edenhofer said when I talked to him a couple of days after this event, after the actual event, not the Archie leagues. And I asked him if he had a backup handheld radio, and he said he did have one in the cockpit, but that it had never been out of the box. And in that situation, in complete darkness, was not the time to be unpacking it and trying to see how to use it. And he assured me that before he went in the air the next time, that he would be fully versed on how that radio worked, and it would be second nature to him before he got in the air again. So he had the equipment, but it was something he thought he would never need, or if he needed it, it would not be in this type of situation, and he was not prepared for that eventuality.
Yeah, I think one of the things with handhelds is that often people go to use them and they find, the batteries are are not working. And that's particularly the case I found with the NiCad batteries. That's why I really like having alkaline batteries. And, if people, just buy a separate alkaline pack if they need to, that's well worth it because those batteries last much longer. The other thing I found is that with the handheld radios in the airplane, they receive pretty well, but they don't always transmit as well because you're kind of in a shielded cage if you're in a metal
Yes.
aircraft. But I have seen cases where people will add external antennas for that handheld radio, and I've tested it, and with an external antenna, controllers have told me they couldn't tell the difference between the handheld and the built-in radios.
Yes, there's several controllers that are also pilots, and several of them have told me that they have an external antenna and that they frequently test that radio and sometimes just use it for the whole flight and have no problems with it if it has that external antenna. But that they said the same thing you did, that if they didn't have that, they might be able to use it to turn on the lights if they needed to, but they probably wouldn't be able to get a whole lot of communications in.
Now, you were talking earlier about having pilots follow their checklist. Are there any checklists that controllers use? And if so, how do you end up using those?
Yes, on the radar screen, we have a drop-down menu and it says checklists, and one of those is the emergency checklist, and it's just a reminder list of all the things that you need to ascertain from the information that you have available to you. If it's an IFR flight, there are several of those things that would be known, like type aircraft, N number. There's a lot of that stuff would be readily available. If you had the aircraft in radar and then you lose them in radar, they want you to mark the position and get the lat longs so that you have that last known position and the heading they were flying. If you're able to communicate with the pilot, gather information, fuel remaining, nature of the emergency, all those sorts of things. If it's an aircraft that you were not previously in contact with that comes on the frequency and is in distress, then there's several more things that you would need to gather: the type of aircraft, the color of the aircraft, just any information that could be helpful in helping them or in finding them.
Okay, good to know. Well, just kind of to wrap things up here, I just want to thank you so much for helping us understand today that there really are situations in life where it's okay to be texting while flying or texting while controlling.
Yes, that is the case. We have a lot of other things that we would do first, but if necessary, we would go to that option as well.
Well, congratulations to you on the Archie League of the Year award. That's really fantastic, and it's an amazing story. And I'm sure as pilots, we're also grateful that you were able to not only help this pilot, but also give us ideas for when we might get in trouble in the future ourselves. Thanks so much for sharing your story here today.
Thank you, Max. Thanks for having me on.
Wow, very moving story with great out-of-the-box thinking by Phil Ennis and his fellow controllers at Fort Worth Center. I don't know about you, but it makes me very proud of the FAA's air traffic control system and of the controllers that we have here in the United States. Now, after Phil and I finish the interview, we continue to talk for a while, and you can hear part of that conversation at the very end of this episode. And remember, for more links and videos related to this story, go out to our Patreon site at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And as regular listeners to this show know, if you think that someday you might buy a new or slightly used Cirrus, please contact me today so I can help arrange a free demo flight for you if you're thinking of a new Cirrus, but also help you understand the many factors, not all of which are obvious, in buying new versus a slightly used Cirrus. I specialize in the Cirrus and work with people around the world. And finally, please take a moment to tell your friends about Aviation News Talk. And if they're not familiar with what a podcast is, just send them to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store to download our dedicated Aviation News Talk podcast apps for iOS and Android. To get the app, just go to the App Store for your phone and do a search for Aviation News Talk, 3 words. And did I mention? Yeah, the apps are free. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. Anyway, I got to tell you, I'm very excited about this story. I love Archie League stories, and every year I go through them and I try and find ones that are relevant to general aviation because that's, my podcast is focused on GA. I'm a flight instructor in GA. And I just think they're great learning lessons and great stories. So.
Yeah, well, this was the first time that I had been to this event, and it was sitting there in that room with the people who had done these things and watching the videos for the first time. You could hear a pin drop, and everyone's on the edge of their seat, just, even though it's like watching, the Apollo 13 movie, how it turns out, but you still are riveted to the story. So it was a great event. I'm so glad that I attended. It was wonderful to be one of the honorees, and glad my family was able to go with me. My older son is actually at the Air Traffic Academy right now in Oklahoma City. He's about 6 weeks away from completion, and hopefully he'll get to come to Fort Worth Center, but there's certainly no guarantee of that. He could end up anywhere, but it'd be nice to have him come work with me for a little while.
And it took a long time to finally connect with these guys and say thank you, and a lot of good qualities. I hope somehow there's a way for these guys to mentor all these young blood coming here, because they have experience, and that counts for a lot. So thank you to everybody. You guys, I always fly IFR whenever I can. I love you guys. I want you to know that. And thanks.